When you compare the size of China and Taiwan, Taiwan would really struggle to defend itself against China's military might.
I'm Venetia Rainey, and this is Battle Lines. It's Friday, October 17th.
We cannot allow ourselves to become numb to the suffering, and I will not be silent.
President Zelensky has for the first time acknowledged that his forces are conducting a cross-border offensive inside Russia.
I just find bombs and I find dead people, but it's a really scary thing for me.
Today we'll be looking at China's aggressive wargames around Taiwan and what it tells us about their plans to, quote, reunify the island with the mainland. Plus, a behind-the-scenes look at a British royals trip to the Sudanese-Chad border and what that shows us about the brutal civil war ongoing in Sudan. We begin in the Taiwanese Strait, where Beijing has this week conducted another round of major military drills and wargames. China mobilised its navy, air force, missile force and land troops to simulate a blockade of the self-governing island democracy, which Beijing claims is its own territory and threatens to annex by force. President Xi Jinping dispatched a record 125 aircraft, as well as an aircraft carrier, to surround Taiwan and its outlying islands. He also made a highly unusual trip to a Chinese island facing Taiwan. I caught up with our Asia correspondent, Nicola Smith, to find out more. Thanks for joining us on Battle Lines, Nikki. We've had some major Chinese military drills this week. I want to rewind a little bit first, though. This all started with a speech by Taiwan's President Lai. What did he say, and why did China take it so badly?
So last week, Taiwan's President Lai Ching-te, he gave a robust but measured speech to mark Taiwan's National Day on the 10th of October, where he pledged to resist annexation. This comes in the face of growing military and economic pressure from Beijing. And he said that Beijing had no right to represent Taiwan. He said that the Republic of China, which is Taiwan's official name, and the People's Republic of China were not subordinate to each other. He also offered to cooperate with China on big issues like climate change as well. And so it was a measured speech, but China reacted with fury. The Chinese Foreign Ministry condemned President Lai for being hell-bent on independence. And later China said that the drills were in response to the drills were in direct response to the speech, that it was a resolute punishment for his continuous fabrication of Taiwan independence nonsense. That's their words. And it was a somewhat predictable response, though, because China, the Chinese government, cannot stand William Lai Ching-te, the president. They view him as a dangerous separatist, and so no matter what he says, they are going to give a very stern response. And they carried out similar drills when he was inaugurated in May.
So what did we learn from these military drills? We've heard that they were practicing a blockade of Taiwan. Did they look very different from the military drills that we saw earlier in May?
Monday's drill did look very similar to the drill that was conducted after the inauguration in May. It also looked very similar to the drills that were conducted when the former US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan in 2022, which greatly angered Beijing. And so, as you said, it took the form of a kind of blockade of the island. It took place in the north of the island, south and east. And on Monday, we saw 153 Chinese aircraft take part in these drills. Some 90 of these aircraft went into Taiwan's air defence identification zone, which is not airspace, but it's the buffer zone just before airspace, official airspace. And we also saw an unprecedented 25 naval and Coast Guard ships approach close to Taiwan's 24-mile contiguous zone. And drones were also taking part. The PLA's rocket force was also taking part in the drills. And so today a Taiwanese official gave a briefing, a security official gave a briefing, and Taiwan's interpretation is that China has been building the capacity to rapidly turn military drills into a full-out attack. Taiwan's very concerned about stability of the Taiwan Strait and of the region, and this official said that these latest drills really squeezed Taiwan's response time and added pressure to Taiwan's capability to respond to a military threat. The official said that China is building a permanent state of readiness, and that readiness is getting higher. And so Taiwan is obviously very concerned about the risks that poses.
Does that run both ways, though? If China is in a permanent state of readiness, is Taiwan also in a permanent state of readiness? And are they able to better wargame themselves what they would do in the event of a blockade, which seems to be what China would use as its first move to try and, quote, reunify Taiwan with the mainland?
I think it's fair to say that both sides are learning from this. We still have a situation, however, where Taiwan would be vastly outmatched in a conflict. It is building up its defence systems. The United States is Taiwan's biggest arms supplier. But when you compare the size of China and Taiwan, Taiwan would really struggle to defend itself against China's military might. So it's doing what it can to build up asymmetric capabilities, which would basically be smaller weapons that could cause maximum damage to an invading force. But a lot of experts say that one of the major risks in the nearer future, it would not be a kind of typical invasion scenario. It would be a blockade where the supplies to the islands are cut off, and that would add economic pressure to Taiwan. It would make living conditions very difficult, and that would be another huge risk to the island that would really undermine, that would fatigue the people. And it's very difficult to know how the international community would respond to that kind of blockade, or even to a conventional military invasion. So Taiwan would definitely need outside help from the international community if China was to attack.
I guess there's an extra element of uncertainty for Taiwan with the US elections coming up. We can assume that Kamala Harris would continue Washington's long-held policy of strategic ambiguity, of supporting Taiwan as a territory that is, independent without declaring independence from China, and insisting to China that it's a red line to invade with military force. But I suppose Donald Trump is a little bit more of a wild card. Is there concern in Taiwan about that?
I think there's always a level of nervousness in Taiwan when a major US election is coming up, in case there are any major changes. But I don't think that Taipei at the moment is anticipating any huge change in US policy. US policy on Taiwan has really been established over decades, many decades, and many presidencies. And it would be highly unusual for one president to reverse that or make any major changes. The US has committed to help Taiwan have the means to defend itself. It does have this policy, long-standing policy of strategic ambiguity, and nobody really knows how the US would respond in the event of an invasion by China. President Biden did indicate several times that the US would come to Taiwan's assistance. There are so many variables in this whole scenario. The world is changing very quickly. We're seeing changing alliances across the Indo-Pacific, but there's no reason to believe that the US is going to change its view on Taiwan, because Taiwan is also so important to not only the United States, but the whole of the international community. The Taiwan Strait, for example, is a major waterway where trillions of dollars of trade pass every year. Taiwan is the world's leading semiconductor manufacturer. It produces over 90% of the most cutting-edge chips for smartphones, data centers, military equipment. It's a very strategic location. If China were to seize Taiwan, that would give China a Pacific coastline where it could drop off submarines into the Pacific. It would also give it much easier access to disputed areas of the South China Sea. So really, it is in the interests of the United States and the rest of the region and the world for stability to be maintained across the Taiwan Strait. So even though Donald Trump may be less predictable in his foreign policy, he also is being backed by an entire administration who do understand the importance of Taiwan to the rest of the world.
We had a lot of discussions over the last few years about how imminent the invasion of Taiwan by China might be. It's dropped out of the headlines recently, been overtaken by events in Ukraine and obviously the Israel-Gaza war. But clearly this is still important for Xi Jinping. We saw this week that he visited Dongshan Island in China's Fujian province, which faces Taiwan. What's the significance of that? What's the message behind that visit?
Well, the world has been distracted by major conflicts in the Middle East, in Ukraine, but China hasn't changed. Xi Jinping has always stated how important the Taiwan issue is to him and to the Chinese government, that this is non-negotiable, that China believes that, or the Chinese Communist Party believes that Taiwan belongs to China, even though the Chinese Communist Party has never ruled Taiwan. But this is a highly sensitive issue in China. It's a highly sensitive issue with the Chinese government. And that hasn't changed, even though the world has been distracted by other conflicts. That doesn't mean that the tensions in the Indo-Pacific have gone away. They're still bubbling in the background. Tensions are increasing in the Indo-Pacific, and specifically over the South China Sea. And it would be a mistake to think that the Indo-Pacific region has gone quiet and that the risk of conflict has disappeared. The risk of conflict is as high as it was a few years ago and is increasing. And it's a very worrying situation.
Thank you so much for joining us, Nicola Smith, our Asia correspondent. Now to Chad, where hundreds of thousands of Sudanese refugees have fled to escape the brutal civil war in their home country. The Sudan war continues to attract little coverage due to a media blackout and lack of international interest. But Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, recently made a visit to the Chad-Sudan border to help shine a light on the horrors of the conflict. Accompanying her was Telegraph senior reporter Henry Bodkin. I talked to him about what he saw on the trip and why she went.
So, the Duchess is a quite long-standing campaigner against sexual violence against women, and in particular as a weapon of war in war zones. She'd previously done work in Ukraine and South Sudan, although quite privately, and she hasn't taken a number of journalists along with her before. But this weekend, we were with her on the Chad-Sudan border in the Darfur region. The point she kept making a number of times was that this is a horrific war, which is, in her phrase, falling out of the consciousness of the international community. She didn't mention it, but obviously we have Ukraine, we have Israel, Gaza, Lebanon, and basically the world's attention is being drawn away, despite the fact that this is arguably the worst war in terms of the humanitarian cost going on in the world today. There's a concern that the amount of aid getting to places like Adre, which was the border crossing we went to and which hosts an enormous refugee camp, which has about 230,000 refugees in at the moment, that aid is reducing when it needs to be expanding. I know the Foreign Office, I know the British government is very worried that Sudan is going to close that border crossing next month, which would make a terrible situation even worse for those refugees. The next border crossing point, I think, to the north is 200 kilometres away. It's really desperate stuff. So I think that's the background of her visit, a long-standing interest in this subject, particularly dire time in the war in Sudan. It's been going on 18 months now. It's only getting worse with concerns over Saudi Arabia and UAE using it as a proxy for their interests in the Middle East. And I think crucially, this, to use her phrase, falling away of consciousness because of what's going on in Ukraine and Gaza and so on.
What kind of stuff was she doing there? Who did she speak to? What did she do?
Well, as is often the way with these royal things, it was rather over-organised and rushed. And of course, security was a big issue. And so they didn't want her on the ground in any one place for that long, which is fairly understandable because it is a rough region and there was fighting just 10 miles away only a few days ago. So that's the context. But in and amongst that, she did spontaneously meet many refugees who've had terrible stories. She went right up to the border, which is a dried riverbed, and she literally greeted families who are coming in on these donkey or pony drawn carts as they crossed the border. I think they were a little bit shocked by the reception, by all the attention, but she asked them how far they'd come and a rough idea of what had happened to them. And she met one young mother, for example, who I grabbed a quick word with afterwards, who had a 9-month-old baby, and she'd come 50 miles. And they told us that any time they'd left their house, they'd been beaten up and essentially were being starved to death by the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, and the Allied Janjaweed militia and that sort of thing. So, but I think in terms of the Duchess's visit, that the centrepiece really was a couple of what was described as intimate meetings with a number of female survivors of sexual violence, rape victims, essentially. And it was interesting because in what was, as I say, quite a kind of rushed and perhaps over-planned trip, this was a meeting that overran, and she was in a secluded tent with these women for quite some time. The press weren't allowed in when she was having those conversations, but she came out and she was visibly distressed. There were tears running down her cheeks. She took a moment she actually went round to the side of the tent quite openly and just stood there on her own to compose herself. And then she came and had a brief conversation with me and a couple of my colleagues, and she was still crying, and she was very direct about what she'd heard and how terrible it was. The phrase that stood out was, in general, was what she described as the complete atrocity of systematic rape of women in this part of Sudan, widespread use of forcing women to have sex, and so essentially rape them in order to give them food, in order to survive to the end of the day, to the end of the week. The women she spoke to said that children are raped quite regularly. This is in and amongst indiscriminate killing. One of the women she spoke to, who a colleague of mine actually grabbed a quick chat with afterwards, said that when her family had made the decision to try to escape their village, they'd come out of their house for the first time in a while, and there were bodies stacked, as she said, like a wall on the street. One kind of quote that the Duchess said, which in a sense was all the more horrific for its kind of ambiguity, was that she just said, I can't bring myself to tell you what they've been doing to children. She said we wouldn't be able to print it even if she did. And so she didn't go into details on that. But the picture she painted was essentially the worst of the worst in terms of what's happening to women, what's happening to children. Most of them are without their men, that they're either dead or they're fighting. And so what she was describing was essentially a completely unprotected, vulnerable population who are in the middle of an ethnic cleansing campaign and a world that's looking elsewhere.
They're funny things, these royal trips to conflict zones. And I suppose they usually happen when aid agencies feel that they really do need to drum up interest somehow. And as you say, Sudan, the conflict in Sudan has really fallen out of the headlines. We did a special episode here on Battle Lines a couple of weeks ago, which I would advise listeners to check out if they want to understand the conflict a bit more. Did you feel like it was a success? Did it feel too staged to get to the reality? Or it sounds like there were some very real moments of raw emotion.
That's a really good question, because I think it was a success in spite of the planning, and it was a success because the Duchess is, I think, probably a decent human being and an authentic person, and also a real pro. I think she knows that whilst it's obviously very important for her to see this firsthand and stuff, that it's the media spotlight which is what can really help with these issues. And I think that, I wouldn't like to put this too strongly, but I sense there was a little bit of tension around the general palace foreign office establishment as to whether it had been structured in the best way possible. But it was the Duchess of Edinburgh meeting those rape survivors, she went into the UNICEF registration tent, so the tent that families go into kind of pretty much immediately after crossing the border. They get a bit of water and they have some jabs and they have an initial interview. it was her experience in there and, I'd say, pretty open emotional reaction to it. And then her decision to talk to me and a couple of my colleagues just in fairly open human terms afterwards, which I think really made it a success. I don't do a lot of royal stuff, but it's amazing apparently how members of the royal family will invite journalists at their own expense to follow them around the world and then not talk to them after they've been to see something. And I think with the Duchess of Edinburgh, she's pretty pragmatic and knows what needs to be done, and seems very comfortable talking emotionally about these things, and that really helped us shine a spotlight on it. We put it on the front page of the newspaper today, and it was prominent on the website, and similar with other publications. So I think it was a success.
And then just finally, I'm curious, you mentioned a bit about people coming over the border, this dried riverbed, these women and children coming over the border. Can you outline where you flew to and how you got there, and what else you observed of the fallout, I suppose, of the Sudanese conflict spilling over into its neighbour Chad?
Chad itself is not amazingly easy to get to. So we flew from London to Addis Ababa and then over to N'Djamena, the capital of Chad, which is in the west of the country. And then you have to get a UNICEF smaller aircraft right back over to the Sudan border in the east of the country. And then it's a couple of hour, very bumpy drive from this little airstrip called Farchana to Adre. So it takes a lot of getting to. It is a very remote region. So in terms of the people coming up, I don't know, it was 38 degrees or something when we were there on Sunday, and that's much cooler than it has been for many months. And a lot of them are on these kind of just flat carts drawn by ponies or donkeys. They are, if not actually starving, then very close to it. This family that we saw come over, that the Duchess greeted, by the way, the mother's name was Hadida Abdullah, and her 9-month-old baby was Baina. I saw a slightly older son of hers just drinking the last drops from a plastic container of water, flies all over his face. It was lucky that they'd arrived there then, because I think that was the last bit of water they had on that cart. They look, as people, they look completely desiccated. They look absolutely exhausted. They've been on the road for many days, sometimes weeks, following probably, I don't know about this particular woman, but following the most horrific violence that would have forced them to leave in the first place. And then the aid agencies, UNICEF, MSF, and so on, are doing their best, and they get jabs, they get water, they'll go to Adre District Hospital, which is where the Duchess met these survivors. But then really, they're just out into the general Adre refugee camp, which has been there for many years now, and it's pretty much full. It's got about 230,000 refugees in it now. And some of them have been there for years, since previous rounds of violence. And it is the size of a town. I mean, we drove through it, and I was trying to get a perspective, trying to think of a town in England that is size-wise, but it's very difficult because nowhere you've ever been in the UK looks like that. But it takes a lot of getting through. It's absolutely vast. These people then just have to try and fashion an existence, and they have nowhere else to go after that. And Chad is not exactly a brilliant country to end up in if you're a refugee, because they have a lot of these problems themselves. Real poverty, sexual violence against women, lack of economic opportunity. It's all there already, but it is relatively stable compared to what's happening on its west and its east. So it's about immediate survival, but long-term hope is very hard to discern there. There were some charities that were working with children, trying to give them psychosocial support, try to deal with their trauma, but their long-term prospects, you look at the camp, you look at the relatively small amount of aid, you look at the fact that most of the West doesn't really think about this or talk about this. There's not a massive cause for hope.
That's Henry Bodkin, our senior reporter, just returned from the Chad-Sudanese border. That's all for Battle Lines this time. Please join us again next week for more of the Telegraph's best foreign reporting. Goodbye. Battle Lines is an original podcast from the Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our news, analysis and dispatches from around the world, subscribe to The Telegraph or sign up to Dispatches, which brings stories from our award-winning correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a live blog on our website where you can follow updates on Israel and Gaza as they come in throughout the day, including insight from contributors to this podcast. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Battle Lines on your preferred podcast app, and if you have a moment, leave a review, as it really helps others find the show. As disinformation is a particular problem during conflict, we are relying on your support more than ever. Battle Lines is part of wider Telegraph foreign coverage in our podcasts. If you're interested in finding out more about the war in Ukraine, you can listen to our sister podcast, Ukraine the Latest. Battle Lines is produced by David Degahi, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.